What happens when a young journalist moves abroad to Turkey in the wake of 9/11?
I still felt as if there was some fundamental thing I hadn't understood about America's place in the world and what that event had meant.
Suzy Hansen will be here to discuss her new book, Notes on a Foreign Country, An American Abroad in a Post-American World. Who were the four Warner brothers, and how did they rise to Hollywood prominence with their founding of one of America's most successful movie studios?
Like many people in that trade, they thought, well, we need good films, so why not try to make some films ourselves? And that's how they got into being both a production house and a distribution company.
Film critic and historian David Thomson will tell us about his new book, Warner Brothers. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Suzy Hansen joins us now. Her new book, Notes on a Foreign Country, An American Abroad in a Post-American World, is reviewed this week on our cover by Hisham Matar. Suzy, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you are actually still living in Istanbul.
Yes.
How long have you lived there?
It's been over 10 years now. I moved there in 2007 to do a journalism fellowship. After the fellowship was over, the financial crisis had happened, and most of my friends said, don't come back. There are no jobs here. And I loved Turkey, and I still felt like I had a lot to understand, so I stayed.
So it's interesting because your book opens with the fact that in the wake of 9/11, you moved to Turkey, but it wasn't really right after September 11th. What precipitated your decision to move?
After September 11th, there was, of course, a time of incredible mourning and introspection, and everybody was learning about the Taliban, Afghanistan, al-Qaeda, everything else. But then at some point, it kind of faded. And I think that I still felt as if there was some fundamental thing I hadn't understood about America's place in the world and what that event had meant, but that it was something that was very shattering and very important. And I did feel as though, even though I was really surrounded by very brilliant people. I was working in New York media and journalism that I, if I didn't go out into the world, I had never really been anywhere, that I was not going to understand a lot of the questions that I had. And so around that time, I had seen a documentary about James Baldwin, who was my favorite writer. And I've discovered in this documentary, by watching this documentary, that he had lived in Istanbul. And I was really surprised by this because it's not what you expect. You knew that he lived in Paris and everything else. And what connection could he have to Turkey? But I think watching the footage, there's this incredible footage of him walking through the old city. It made Istanbul, the city kind of stuck in my mind, but it also made me wonder, why was this place such a place of comfort for him? And what did he learn there? And even though he never wrote about Turkey and never wrote about Istanbul, what I did find was that Turkish journalists interviewed him. And he was saying that what he was seeing was the beginning of the American empire, essentially, because Turkey was one of America's Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine countries. And he said that it filled him with great trepidation because here he was seeing his country at home, the United States being roiled by the civil rights crisis and the civil rights movement. And then he was watching this country kind of throwing these unresolved problems out into the world. Mm-hmm. And this was very terrifying to him. And I thought, wow, this is a really interesting juxtaposition of our domestic and our international realms.
During the time that you were in Turkey, that country and its relationship with both America and Europe changed a lot as well. I mean, you got there after Erdogan came to power. But what have you seen in terms of of his influence, and especially as a journalist, given what he's done with the country's tradition of journalism?
It's interesting because when I arrived, it was right before the 2007 election, which was a very controversial one. There were massive protests against the AKP, against his party, and against the fact that there was, for the first time, going to be a religious president. But a lot of these protests at the time were seen as anti-democratic because the military was threatening to intervene. And so at that particular time, there was a tremendous amount of sympathy for Erdogan and for the party. It seemed as if, okay, some religious people had felt oppressed in Turkey for a long time. They are asserting themselves. This is a natural course of things. This had to happen at some point. And so a lot of people, liberals, leftists in Turkey, as well as journalists, were quite sympathetic to AKP. people compare him to Trump, but at that time he actually was using this language of and this rhetoric of reconciliation and human rights and freedom and democracy and inclusivity. So,
right. And Turkey was basically controlled by the military.
Yes, exactly. And so everybody knew in order for it to become a full democracy, the military had to get out of politics. So this all made a lot of sense. But very quickly, there were these trials that these sort of sham trials against the opposition. And nobody could really figure out what was going on with those at first, but it became clear eventually that it was just, to get rid of the opposition and that things were taking a very, very dark turn. And that has been the case ever since. But because I think the West has been so desperate or was so desperate, especially at that time, for a kind of model Muslim country. It took a long time for people to realize really what was happening, even though he was jailing dozens and dozens of journalists. Freedom of expression has always been a problem in Turkey. Mm-hmm. It has been a problem forever. But it's just that at this point, it's become really a tremendous crisis and a real nightmare for Turkey's journalists.
How much did Erdogan's ascension have to do with Turkey's relationship with America, and how much did it have to do with their estrangement from Europe and their rejection from the EU? Well,
I think these are very different things, actually, and I think that it's something that I didn't quite realize at first, the relationship with the U.S. and the relationship with Europe. And in many ways, the relationship with the U.S. historically, and this is what I talk about in my book, has been a fairly, I think, toxic one, because it was one of America's primary allies in the Cold War. And so we relied on its military and we relied on the country to some degree being authoritarian for a long time. And I think that we supported some bad elements in the political structure that didn't help Turkey in the long run. And it took me a long time to also realize is that Erdogan, to a large degree, is a product of American influence, because after the 1980 military coup in Turkey, the United States pushed Turkey in a direction that was both more capitalist and more Islamist. And the person who really benefited from those two strains was Tayyip Erdogan, for sure. So, I mean, I think that that's kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind now that he is demonized. He has long, deep roots in sort of the American-Turkey relationship. But I think that with Europe, it's a different story. Europe, I think, was for a long time really pushing Turkey to be more responsible about human rights and to adopt certain reforms. And all of the reforms that Erdogan adopted in the beginning that he was lauded for were really, to become closer to the EU and into EU standards. But what has happened is with the refugee crisis, basically he has carte blanche to do whatever he wants now. And for example, the Kurdish leader, Selahattin Demirtas, is in jail and has been in jail for months and months. And nobody even talks about it. And I think that even in the 90s, when the Kurdish issue was very, very important in Europe, you wouldn't have seen something like this. And it's really a tragedy.
To go back to the relationship between Turkey and America, and also to the ideas of your book in terms of figuring out your own place in all of this, did you go to Turkey thinking, I'm going to one of sort of the good guys, the allies of America, I will be in a friendly place? And if that was your preconception going in, how did that shift?
Well, it's interesting because I think this is one of the major realizations that I had as soon as I got there, which was that I didn't know that much about Turkey's history with the U.S. And I think that there are a few countries that Americans tend to know about in terms, we know about Vietnam, obviously, and Iraq, and maybe Chile. But I think that Turkey is not one that is really high up on our list, even though it really has been one of our most important allies for a long time. And I think that one of the things that really gave me pause as a foreign correspondent and as a thinker was that, oh my goodness, I have come here, I studied up on the headscarf issue and on, the history of Islamism in Turkey, but I did not know about my own country's relationship with Turkey and how that might have produced my own prejudices or biases against it or whatever. And I think that this is a realization I kept having in every place that I went to, including Greece and including Egypt, which was my country has had a very deep and long relationship with all of these places. And I am also a product of that relationship. But we as Americans, I think of ourselves as very separate from our foreign policy for some reason. And my book is kind of trying to reconcile that and to actually, I'm arguing that it's an intimate relationship that is one that we should really engage in much more and be much more conscious of.
You grew up in suburban New Jersey, and then you worked at the New York Observer, maybe one of the most sort of New York-y, kind of insular in a way, excellent in its time, newspapers. And you said that you hadn't traveled abroad. So what was that like for you to move to this foreign city and settle yourself in and figure out your place there?
I was a mess. I mean, I really didn't know how to go about it. I think that this is, I watch other young foreign correspondents or people who have moved abroad, and they seem to know how to move to a foreign country. I mean, this seems like this should be obvious. You go about a certain number of things. You take the language classes, and you try to become, more deeply involved in the culture, and you try to meet people. But it's actually quite difficult because you are an outsider. Mm-hmm. People have their own friends. I mean, Turks have their friends. They're not necessarily. Nobody's necessarily open to this random person who has moved to the city. I was lucky enough to make wonderful friends, but it was really very, very, very difficult. But I was so happy to be there. I mean, the city was just so enchanting to me that I think I rode that high for a while. But I think that everyone who moves to Turkey as a writer or a journalist realizes that Turkey is very, very hard to understand. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you can say that about every foreign country, but I think that it's such a unique and interesting and complicated history that is unlike any other country's history, that it took me 2 years before I felt comfortable writing about it.
Give an example of that. Like, what makes it so different?
I think that even just the ideas of the difference between right and left. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's sort of, in Turkey, there's the Kemalist left and there's the Marxist left. And, these people will call themselves leftists, but that has nothing to do with why these people will call themselves leftists. Or maybe there are certain ways that they overlap in terms of economic policies, but not in terms of maybe their xenophobia or their feelings about the U.S. I mean, the Islamists break down into all different, there's the pro-American Islamists and there's the anti-American Islamists. The fact that Turkey was a pawn in the Cold War makes these identities very splintered and very, very complicated. For example, the Fethullah Gülen movement, which is allegedly responsible for the military coup last year, they were an anti-communist, pro-American movement at one point, which is why a lot of people think that they were allied. But this was true. This was part of Turkey's history. I mean, this is just takes a lot to untangle.
I think that's one of the hardest things when you move abroad as an American is sort of trying to fit your own politics into this totally different paradigm. You go to France and you think, wait a minute, am I a socialist? Am I actually conservative here? Like right. What? And I also wonder if you had that same feeling as a woman going to this different country, which has a tradition of being a kind of liberal Muslim, sort of secular, at least until quite recently, officially secular country.
Some people have asked me why I didn't write more about that. There's a little bit of that in the book. But sometimes I think when you move abroad, certain parts of your identity assert themselves more than others. And for whatever reason, I was really experiencing Istanbul and Turkey as an American. It was just much, much stronger. So I wasn't as in touch with myself, I think, as a woman. I think that one thing that I describe in the book is that other Turkish women thought that I must be having a difficult time because I look foreign, I have red hair, I have freckles, I don't look like Turks, that, maybe men who were not used to seeing foreigners might be treating me badly. But honestly, I did not find it to be a difficult situation. I think that Turkish women have a much harder time than I did, for example, because in a way, I'm just different.
Do you find yourself as an American living abroad to be sort of in the constant position of either explaining Turkey to Americans or explaining America to the rest of the world?
Very few people ask me about Turkey when I come home, actually. I think that, especially now, everybody's very consumed by what's happening here. But the thing is about foreigners is that foreigners, and this is one of my major points in the book as well, foreigners know America very well. Right. And it's more often...
It's almost embarrassing how well they know it.
It's embarrassing, and it's embarrassing how well they know us. And it's more often that, you'll see an American say to maybe a Turkish person, oh, do you know about this movie, or do you know about this cultural phenomenon, or do you know this musician? And the Turkish person is just like, what are you talking about? Of course I do, because they have obviously been exposed to American culture for so long, but also they're interested in it. I mean, they were interested in America. Their newspapers have pages devoted to American news. And I think that this is the realization I was having, was this incredibly bizarre power imbalance in the sense that the United States had power over these countries and we knew nothing, but we know nothing about them. And yet they know everything about us. And this was also something that Baldwin talked about, Black people and white people in America, that white people had power over Blacks, but they knew nothing about them, whereas the African American population knew white people really, really well and really intimately. And it's a kind of scandalous disconnect.
Well, your book goes a certain way in trying to explain that scandal and hopefully clarify it somewhat in the minds of readers. Suzy, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Suzy Hansen is the author of Notes on a Foreign Country, An American Abroad in a Post-American World.
He's looking at you, kid.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
What we've got here is failure.
David Thomson, the film critic and historian, joins us now to talk about his new book, Warner Brothers, The Making of an American Movie Studio. David, thanks for being here.
Very happy to be here.
This is part of Yale University's esteemed Jewish Live series, and I'm curious, how does that work? Did you come up with the idea to write about the Warner Brothers, the four Warner Brothers, or is that something they proposed to you?
We had been talking about doing something in the Jewish Live series, and a few topics arose, and for one reason or another, they didn't quite work. And it was, in fact, Yale who suggested Warner Brothers, which was a little outside their regular system in that it was about a group and a corporation. Their books in the past have really been about single figures, and I found that very intriguing. And, it offered the chance to really sketch in the story of what is a great studio, which depended very much on the dynamic among four and then three of the brothers.
So these books, for readers not familiar with them, are brief books. They're usually around 200 pages. Was it challenging to fit four lives and a studio into that length?
Well, it was clear that it had to be pretty selective. There's an enormous number of films made by Warner Brothers that I don't talk about in the book, but equally, anyone who is a cinephile or a film goer or a film fan knows 20, 30, 40 or so of the great pictures Warner's made between about 1927 and, say, 1967. And I thought concentrate on those, but bring in a lot of titles that people are not too familiar with, and just give an overall picture of what that studio accomplished, because it had a very, very special signature tone to its movies.
So before we go into that, let's start with the men themselves. Who were the four brothers, and how did they come to found this studio?
Harry, Albert, and Sam had all been born in what was either called Poland or a part of Russia. They came to America. On the way, the youngest, Jack, was born in Canada, and the four of them took root in America. They tried a great many different trades and professions. They were not natural filmmakers, but they got into the film exchange business, having films really for rental or distribution. And like many people in that trade, they thought, well, we need good films, so why not try to make some films ourselves? And that's how they got into being both a production house and a distribution company.
And of those brothers, I think most people, if they're familiar with one brother, it's probably Jack. But what role did each of them play in Warner Brothers?
Well, Harry was the senior. He was very much the sort of father figure, the godfather figure, if you like, to the family. He was respectable, orderly. He was the most orthodox Jewish of the four of them, not that he was particularly devout. Albert, the second, really is the least significant as a character. Sam was very active in the achievement of sound, which is, I think, really the great early turning point in the studio's history. And he died during that process of finding sound on film. And Jack was the kid. Jack was the most flamboyant, the most showy. Jack liked to tell funny stories. He liked to sing songs. And he was a shock. He was the least likable, but I think clearly the most influential. And he and Harry really got into increasing rivalry as the years went by. The studio prospered, but eventually, and I told that story, Jack really, through sheer cunning and intrigue, took over control of the whole studio. And observers, people in the family, thought that that broke Harry's heart.
You call him maybe the biggest scumbag ever to get into a Jewish Live series.
Well, Jack Warner, yes. And another thing that intrigued me was that most of the people who've been dealt with in the Jewish Live series are sort of noblemen or noble women in history. They have great achievement, and they have more or less fine character. Nobody could really accuse Jack Warner of that. He was not a good guy. Most of the people who worked for him didn't like him, didn't trust him. I don't think he could ever have made a movie on his own. He was not really a creative person, but he had something that was vital in the history of the movie business. He was a great organizer, a great hirer of talent, and a very shrewd, quick judge of what might work with the public.
And yet, even though you say he wasn't creative, you argue in your book that there was such a thing as a Warner Brothers studio film, that there was a kind of character to those films. Was that Jack, or was that attributable to something else?
I think it had to do with Jack. I think that most of the films are about guys, particularly, who he would have liked to be. He had a sort of fantasy relationship with a lot of his own characters. But there were other people who were vital to that, and none more so than a man who in history is associated with another studio. I mean Darryl Zanuck, who was really the story production chief at Warner's in the late 20s and early 30s. And if anyone shaped the pattern of musicals, gangster films, social problem pictures, it was Zanuck.
Let's talk about the different studios and a little bit more about what made Warner Brothers distinctive from the other studios. I think everyone knows that of MGM musicals. What was a Warner Brothers movie?
Well, the great Warner Brothers films are short. Not many of their films went over 90 minutes. A lot of the good ones are under that. They are tough, melodramatic situations. They are full of a kind of cynical, wry attitude to the world. They adore tough guy heroes, women who are sometimes antagonistic to the tough guy heroes, but usually come along with their worldview. And they're not cynical pictures necessarily, but they're very realistic about the conflict between hope and idealism. No studio grasped the mood of the Depression better, which was to take a certain sort of tough, realistic, optimistic, but not boastful attitude to what was going on. And in my opinion, these films stand the test of time better than any studio's output in that period. I think time has proved Warner Brothers to be a terrific studio operation.
When you refer to those films of the 30s, of the Depression, which films in particular come to mind as exemplifying?
Well, a lot of the gangster pictures, Little Caesar, The Public Enemy, what I would call social issue pictures. I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, which I think is really a classic. Babyface, but it's in the musicals too. I talk in the book about a sequence from Gold Diggers of 1933 where Joan Blondell sings a very big, epic number, Remember My Forgotten Man. And the forgotten man is the sort of hero from the First World War who has been dumped upon by society during the Depression and has become hobos and tramp figures, potentially gangster figures, because one of the feelings in the Warner Brothers pictures was that kids whose future had been closed down by the socioeconomic situation, they turned to outlawry, and it was almost a legitimate response. If you look ahead, that's very much the impulse behind Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, which was a Warner Brothers picture.
You also describe these movies as being very American. Where did that come from?
I think it came from their intense immigrant desire to become American, to be recognized as American. They had no instinct for going back to the Poland or Russia they had come from. They wanted to be American. They changed their names. Later in life, Jack Warner was asked, do you ever think of going back to the part of the world in Eastern Europe where your family came from? And he laughed at it. He said, are you kidding? I'm not interested. I've abandoned that. I've become an American. And that's a kind of tough survivalist attitude that clearly exists as much today as it did then. People's coming here, I'm one of them. I'm English. I came here because I wanted to be American. I identify with that. I am still English in a lot of ways, but I opted really to try to be an American. And that attempt is a vital part of American experience.
The four brothers were all Jewish, observant to varying degrees, and this is part of the Jewish Lives series. I'm curious if that came through in their films, and did World War II especially impact what they did?
Yeah, among the American studios, Warner's were the most attuned to the threat of fascism. They were the most aware of trying to make a movie that warned about the war that was to come. I don't want to exaggerate how committed they were to that, because they also wanted to cling on to the European market as long as they could. But they were pretty shrewd readers of the situation, and they knew what was coming, and they knew that movies were going to have to deal with it. And I give Jack great credit for that. Jack was a man who, he had his finger on the pulse of his times, and I think The Great Showman always had a terrific ability to read the wishes and the desires of an audience.
I want to end with the way that you begin your book, which is with a fun, kind of provocative line. You start off saying, families are alike, whatever they say. How would you describe the Warner Brothers, and how, again, did that come through in their work?
Well, I think they sort of had a basic failure to really marry their ideas. They said, we're a family, we're all for one, and yet in practice they behaved in a kind of selfish, competitive way. They said they loved each other, but if you look at it in detail, they were warring brothers. That's an issue in a lot of their films. East of Eden is a great film about rival brothers. Now, I'm not saying Jack Warner took that project on for that direct reason, but so many of their films have this kind of pattern of guys who may be brothers or best friends and then fall into opposition. And you know, I think that's very true to life, in that family is a great image and ideal of togetherness, but family is also where sibling rivalry begins. And you see that year after year in Warner Brothers films.
All right. Well, I think many listeners will now be adding lots of movies to their Netflix queues. So, David, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
David Thomson is the author of many books on film, and most recently, Warner Brothers, The Making of an American Movie Studio. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, Greg Coles, John Williams, and Jen Salai. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
All right. So two of us were on vacation and therefore at a great advantage, Greg and me. So let's start with those slackers who are here working in the office and not reading as much. John?
Welcome back, guys.
Great to have you back.
Yeah. Last week, I talked about having read Jeff Dyer's just richly imagined and incredibly written book about jazz called But Beautiful. And because of that, I kind of not only listened to some of the musicians that he wrote about, but then it got me thinking about some of the books on my shelf that I've been meaning to read about the genre. And the first one that I picked up is Miles Davis's autobiography, which a jazz-playing friend of mine had recommended just as kind of an outrageous, storytelling exercise, because I was expecting it to be chatty and, demotic, but I had no idea how much. I mean, it really is just like someone turned on a tape recorder, and Miles, who's, a brilliant musician, but he just kind of repetitively says things about how bad, meaning good, certain musicians are, and just swears basically in every sentence. But it's getting to the point where he's in New York and he's playing with people like Charlie Parker, and there are, good anecdotes about people, but it's not very deep. It's sort of like sitting on a bar stool next to Miles Davis, and there are worse people obviously to be hanging out with. And then I also started reading Deep in a Dream, which is James Gavin's biography of the trumpet player Chet Baker, a trumpet player and singer. I love his vocals. That's a much more obviously sort of stylish and smart look at Baker's life. And so I'm about 100 pages into Miles and about 50 pages into Chet, and I'll probably balance them on and off for a little while.
Jen?
So right now I just picked up, I picked up again a book that I had started a while back and then put it aside for a bit, called The Dark Dark, which is a collection of stories by Samantha Hunt, which actually John Williams reviewed for The Daily a few weeks back. And, I was talking with John about this morning, that I'm just so impressed with what she does in this collection, which is she sort of combines things that are truly sort of dark, of course, and horrific in a way, but also injects a lot of humor into it. Mm-hmm. And the stories so far, a lot of them have to do with changing bodies, women thinking about pregnancy, that kind of thing, but also sort of counteracting it with certain domestic scenes, which seem really sort of ordinary. And one of the stories in here, there's a guy who, at the beginning of the story, it starts off from his perspective, and he's driving along a road and he hits a dog. And so he goes into the house where the dog came from, and he meets this woman. And so what we learn about this woman is that she, like Samantha Hunt, has 3 kids, and the husband is not at home. He's taken the kids out, and this is how she describes it. Earlier, Suzanne's husband had detected a certain ticking in her. He'd packed their children into the car for a night of pizza and a double feature at the second-run movie theater, leaving her alone to explode, to splatter the house with a combination of things she'd ingested as a teenager, films and punk rock records that confirmed what she'd guessed back then. One dies alone. And so there's something kind of funny about that, but also extremely dark. So I just...
Well, it is called
The Dark Dark. So I know that that's just the adjective that I keep going back to. But so far, I'm really enjoying this book.
Had you read her novel, Mr. Splitfoot?
I have not read any of her other work. So
in real life, she is married to Joe Higgin, who is the author of the forthcoming biography of Jan Wenner. They're a power writer couple.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
She has her book, I think it's called The Invention of Everything Else, which was her sort of second ago novel, is really great. It's sort of a fictionalized take on the last days of the inventor Nikola Tesla, who's sort of dying in this fever dream in the New Yorker hotel, and it kind of is from his perspective and the perspective of this maid who works at the hotel, and I thought that was really lovely.
And I can vouch for Mr. Splitfoot too, which is a kind of ghost story, really a wonderful, also dark and very much like a kind of fairy tale.
Yeah, she's sort of like gothic, magical, but also realistic. It's an interesting mix of stuff.
And it's also funny because I feel like until fairly recently, I wasn't reading any sort of gothic magical stuff, and then for the past 6 months or so,
you.
I don't know why, but these are the stories that I want to read.
Greg, what do you have in front of you?
Well, so I have just spent 2 weeks on the beach in Nantucket, and the books that I brought with me were both books that I had talked about on this show. One was Bruce Springsteen's autobiography, Born to Run. The other was this Emmanuel Carrère book, The Kingdom, which is about the early days of Christianity. And
John took up The Kingdom after you left on vacation originally.
Is that right?
He did.
Yeah.
And he was hoping last week Carrère wouldn't come up but he did, because I was reading one of his novellas.
The fact
Career
is,
will always
we were trying to
come up.
have a career-free podcast, Greg.
Sorry, guys.
and the fact is that I am reading these 2 jazz books, and I am also reading Career. So, go ahead.
So I, in fact, finished both of those books early in my vacation and was left suddenly bookless.
You underpacked for 2 weeks.
I know.
2 books.
I know. And so I hit a bookstore that I like on Nantucket called Nantucket Bookworks. And what was interesting about it is that on their new releases table, mixed in, with all of these books that I've seen at work, that I've assigned at work, books that I was, well acquainted with in recent days, were all of these books by Italo Calvino.
New releases?
Yeah, they were all on the new releases table. I think there must have just been a Calvino fan working in the bookstore who wanted these books to be read.
I know what I'll do. I'll stick them on the front table.
And I have read Calvino in the past and greatly enjoyed him. I've read his take on Italian folktales, and I've read Invisible Cities and If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, but I had never read his short novel, The Baron in the Trees, which was one of the ones on this new releases table. It's not a new release. It was published like 60 years ago.
I mean, geologically speaking.
So I bought The Baron in the Trees, and that became my beach reading. It's a short novel, so it took me to the end of my vacation, but I've finished that as well. Calvino did a lot of postmodern kind of meta stuff. This book is not so meta, but it just has this outrageous premise. It's not quite magical, but it's set in the mid to late 1700s, kind of the Age of Enlightenment in France. It takes place in Italy on a town called Ombrosa on the coast in Italy. And it is about a nobleman, a baron in this town, who takes to the trees at age 12. He gets in a family argument, and out of kind of spite and stubbornness, he runs outside and climbs the trees in the garden, and he remains in the trees for the rest of his life. He never sets foot on the ground again. He hunts from the trees. He has romances, and he just lives his entire life out in the trees, not just in his garden. It's a heavily wooded area, and he travels miles and crossing into forests and neighbors' gardens and things like that. And it covers, the rise of kind of the Freemasons, the decline of the Jesuits at that time. He corresponds with Voltaire and Rousseau, and
from the trees.
All from the trees.
Good postal service.
He acquires a printing press at one point and writes these kind of philosophical treatises.
Yeah. I would say this is more than kind of magical.
Well, it's.
But is it gothic?
In fact, no magic happens in the book. Right. It's just this entirely outrageous premise that he plays straight. And you read, I read with a smile on my face the whole time. It's just utterly delightful and charming. And, it feels like somebody just telling you this fairy tale, a shaggy dog tale.
You're inspiring me. I haven't read him since If on a Winter's Night of Travel, which was 1 billion years ago, but this sounds tempting.
It's great.
Pamela, you were also on vacation, and I think you read 8 or 9 things.
No.
Let's go through them in order.
I read 3.5, but it's funny. I didn't run out of books. My kids ran out of books. And so I also found myself in a local bookstore shopping for books. And one of the interesting things, I was in South Dakota, that you realize, and certainly my kids realized very much for the first time for them, is how hard it is to find books sometimes in the outside of major metropolitan areas. But there was a really great bookstore in Rapid City called Mitzi's Bookstore. And at one point, one of my kids purchased the first 2 in a series. I wasn't sure if he would like them. And then we, took off for other parts of South Dakota, and we're about 3 hours away from Mitzi's Bookstore. And he was like, okay, I'm ready for the final in the trilogy. And he's like, let's go back to Rapid City. And it's not that easy to go back to Rapid City to get the final book in the trilogy. But I made do with the books that I had. And I've kind of learned to overpack with books simply because I've underpacked so many times, and you never know what you're going to feel like reading when you're on a long vacation. So I left reading Pachinko, which I talked about on an earlier podcast by Min Jin Lee. And I had that funny experience where, You know when you are talking to someone and then you look down at the page and the word that you were just saying or that someone said is on the page, I feel like there should be a Scrabble word for that. I was having like a related thing go on, which was that each book I picked up, though very different from the one I'd read before, had within the first few pages sort of some little link. So I went from Pachinko, which is about Koreans living in Japan, and is that's sort of largely a function of World War II and in the Pacific and of the Korean War. And then the next book I picked up was The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. And I'd never read Philip K. Dick. And I didn't know what I guess many other readers of Philip K. Dick know, which is that his books are much better movies than they are books. And they all have these great premises. And at least judging on this one book, it was a really great premise. It's a famous premise in which Japan and Germany win World War II and slavery is legal in America, and America is sort of controlled in part by Japan and in part by Nazi Germany. And it was sort of one of the foundational works of alternative history. And that's about all the good stuff that I have to say about it. But it had that tenuous link of, the Pacific arena of World War II. And then the next book that I picked up had another weird link. And now I see it's not really a link. It was a mistake of a link. But the supposed man in the high castle is a writer named Hawthorne Abendsen. And the next book I picked up was one that Elida Becker, a colleague, reviewed in the Times called South Pole Station, which I thought had a really fun premise. It's a first novel by a woman named Ashley Shelby about researchers at the South Pole in Antarctica. And I thought that the best parts of it were the sort of sociological study of this group of kind of oddballs, researchers, and then people on the artists and writers program in Antarctica. She had to have done that program herself to be able to write about it with such specificity. And it was sort of the characters and situations particular to that area that were the best parts of the novel. So, for example, they look at those at South Pole, look at the people who are at McMurdo, which is on the edge of Antarctica. They look down on them as sort of like those are the people that live in the tropics because it's nothing compared to the weather at South Pole. And I think the best chapter has to do with a sort of sous chef, which is really not the right word, given the kind of cuisine at the kind of institutional cafeteria down there, who is hired basically with the understanding that she is to overthrow the longtime chef. And it has this whole critique of the Moosewood Cookbook and its related books, The Enchanted Broccoli Forest, and the fact that this other chef who was really terrible relied so heavily on those books. That was a really good chapter.
That's really funny.
Yeah. But the tenuous link, which I now realize was a misreading, was that South Pole Station is named after the early explorer Amundsen, which I read as being the same as Abendsen, Hawthorne Abendsen.
Close enough.
Close enough.
Yeah, if you're looking for links,
that's clearly who Philip K. Dick had in mind.
Right. Yes. And then I started reading a novel that I'll talk about in a few weeks on the podcast because the author is going to come on, which is a YA novel by a writer, Kristen Kishore, who I like a lot, called Jane Unlimited. And I'll leave that discussion until I talk to Kristen, but I'll just say that she was the author of a trilogy called the Graceling Trilogy that was high fantasy that I read for my children's book club a number of years ago and really loved. And then she had a long break before writing this novel, which is very much a departure. So that's my reading.
Nice. Wow, you really packed it in for the vacation. I'm jealous that I'm going to go away.
She was in South Dakota.
I have a train to catch.
You're right. There was not a lot of movie going, and there were other things in South Dakota.
Sorry, South Dakotans.
There were long stretches in which one could read. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.